Tyler didn't even glance at the dispatch map on the wall, the one I'd spent 20 years memorizing. He just tapped his pristine iPad screen and told me, without a hint of irony, that my salary was legacy waste compared to his new routing app. He claimed his algorithm could manage 200 drivers better than I ever could. I didn't argue. I just packed my mug and left. He thought he was trimming fat. He didn't realize he was cutting the brake lines. 3 weeks later, his perfect app led our entire fleet straight into a historic blizzard that I would have spotted days ago. Before I tell you how my resignation turned their logistics network into a frozen parking lot, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever been told your experience was obsolete, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to see the aftermath. My name is Martha Higgins, and for 22 years, I have served as the invisible, gravitational anchor, holding ironclad logistics together against the chaotic tides of the transportation industry. I am 52 years old, and while you will not find my name etched into the frosted glass doors of the executive suite nor printed on the glossy, high-definition sales brochures that promise seamless global integration, every single one of our 200 drivers knows exactly who I am. To the corporate board sitting in their climate-controlled ivory tower, I was merely a line item in the annual budget labeled Regional Dispatch Director, a recurring cost to be analyzed, scrutinized, and eventually minimized. But to the men and women hauling 50 tons of steel, produce, and automotive components across the frozen, unforgiving interstates of North America, I was simply Mother. I was the calm, steady voice on the radio at 3 a.m., talking them down from a panic attack when a sudden blizzard shut down the I-80 inches Wyoming and left them blind in a whiteout. I was the strategist who knew instinctively which way stations in Ohio were lenient on a Tuesday night, and which ones would pull you over and scour your logbooks for a microscopic mudflap violation. I was the only person in the entire building who understood, in my bones, that logistics is not a math problem to be solved with clean equations, but a living, breathing, chaotic beast to be tamed with grit, diesel fumes, and respect. I had built this department from a room of shouting men and whiteboards into a precision instrument, fueling it with caffeine and loyalty, and I genuinely believed, with a naivety that now embarrasses me, that my institutional knowledge was the mortar holding the bricks of this company together. I was wrong. The end of my career didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion or a shouting match in the hallway. It arrived with the sterile, rhythmic hum of a server rack and the clicking of a stylus on a tablet screen. Tyler, the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, sat at the head of the mahogany conference room table, looking less like a logistics executive and more like a tech startup founder who had taken a wrong turn into the gritty world of transportation. At 32, he possessed a resume overflowing with buzzwords about disruption, scalability, and synergy. But he had never changed a tire in the freezing rain, never smelled the acrid scent of a burning clutch on a semi-truck, struggling up a 6% grade, and never looked a driver in the eye to tell him he wasn't making it home for his daughter's birthday because a load was critical. He didn't look at me during the meeting, and he certainly didn't look at the massive, pin-studded map of the United States I had maintained on the wall for 2 decades, a map where every pin represented a driver I knew by name. To him, that map was just dusty wall art, a relic of a bygone analog era. Instead, he stared obsessively at his dashboard, a colorful array of pie charts and trend lines that reduced the complex, messy reality of my drivers' lives into clean, sanitized data points. He cleared his throat, a sound devoid of any real authority, and informed me that Ironclad was pivoting to a digital-first strategy, a phrase that sounded innocuous but carried the weight of a professional execution. He called it the grid. It was a proprietary automated dispatching system powered by artificial intelligence designed to route trucks, assign loads, and manage driver logs without human intervention. Tyler explained, with the condescending patience one might use on a slow child or an elderly relative struggling with a television remote, that my salary and the salaries of my senior dispatch team represented a legacy inefficiency that could no longer be justified in the current market. He told me that the grid could calculate routes 40% faster, predict traffic patterns with 90% greater accuracy, and optimize fuel consumption better than any human brain ever could. He spoke of reducing friction and eliminating human error, as if the human element was a disease to be cured rather than the soul of the business. He didn't fire me right there. The corporate legal department wouldn't allow that risk given my age and tenure. Instead, he slid a thick document across the polished table. A transition plan offering me the role of customer experience monitor. It was a demotion so insulting, it was almost impressive in its cruelty. I would be stripped of all decision-making power, removed from the dispatch floor where I had reigned for 2 decades, and placed in a glass cubicle to answer phones and apologize to clients when things went wrong, all while his algorithm drove the fleet into the ground. He smiled a thin, tight smile, expecting me to be grateful that he hadn't just thrown me out on the street to fend for myself. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the heavy mahogany table, though the urge trembled in my hands. I simply looked at his soft, uncalloused hands, manicured and clean, and then at the window where a storm front was gathering over the city skyline, turning the sky a bruised purple. I asked him a single question, my voice dropping to that low, steady register I used when talking a rookie driver through an ice storm on the descent into Denver. "Tyler," I said, locking eyes with him for the first time, "does your app know the personal cell phone number of the customs supervisor at the Sweetgrass border crossing? Does it know that he requires a specific secondary manifest for automotive parts on Tuesdays, or the truck gets impounded for 48 hours? Tyler laughed, a dismissive, airy sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Martha," he replied, checking his smartwatch as if I were wasting his valuable time. "The grid pulls data directly from federal databases. It doesn't need buddies at the border. It needs code. And frankly, your reliance on these old-school favors and handshake deals is exactly the kind of liability we're trying to eliminate. We are building a system that is robust, not one that relies on whether you sent someone a Christmas card." In that moment, the severance package wasn't a tragedy. It was a lifeboat. I realized he wasn't just arrogant, he was dangerous. He was handing the keys of a Ferrari to a toddler and claiming that the car would drive itself. I signed the acknowledgement form with a steady hand, my silence ringing louder than any objection I could have voiced. The breakdown of his perfect system began quietly, just 48 hours later, in the dead silence of a Tuesday night. The world of logistics does not sleep. It merely shifts gears. My personal cell phone buzzed on my nightstand at 2:14 a.m., piercing the silence of my bedroom. It wasn't the corporate line. Tyler had already routed those to his new automated help desk to streamline communication, but the veteran drivers, the ones who had been with me since the beginning, had my personal number memorized for true emergencies. I answered to hear the panicked voice of Jim, a driver with 15 years of experience and a safety record that was spotless, shouting over the roar of wind and idling engines. He was stuck at the Canadian border, exactly where I had warned Tyler he would be. The customs agent had flagged his load of critical automotive components engine blocks destined for a just-in-time assembly line in Ontario because the digital paperwork generated by the grid was missing a specific hazardous materials declaration code. The app on Jim's dashboard simply flashed a generic processing error, a spinning wheel of death. And when he called the new support line, he had been on hold for 40 minutes, listening to elevator music while his delivery window slammed shut. I sat up in the dark, the adrenaline of 20 years kicking in, my heart rate spiking not from fear, but from the familiar rush of crisis management. I couldn't log into the company system to fix the code. My admin access had been pending revocation since the meeting, but I didn't need a computer. I needed leverage. I dialed the direct line of the night supervisor at that border station, a man named Carl whom I had helped out of a jam with a lost shipment 3 years prior. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Martha?" he asked, confused. "Why are you calling on a personal line? I thought you guys switched to that automated clearinghouse system." I explained the situation briefly, keeping my voice calm and professional, vouching for Jim and the cargo personally. "The system is new, Carl," I lied smoothly, protecting the company that was actively trying to destroy me. "It's a glitch in the API integration. I'm emailing you the manual override confirmation now." I didn't email anything, but my voice was enough. Carl grunted, the sound of a man weighing protocol against trust. "All right, Martha. Since it's you, but tell your IT guys to get their act together. Next time the truck sits," I heard the heavy thud of the stamp hitting the paper over the phone. Jim was free. I hung up, staring at the phone in the darkness, feeling the cold plastic against my ear. I had just saved the company $50,000 in late penalties and a potential contract breach, and they didn't even know it. Tyler would wake up, see the green checkmark on his dashboard, and think his algorithm had solved the problem. That was the moment my loyalty finally died. It wasn't murdered, it starved to death from a lack of recognition. The next morning, I initiated my exit strategy. I didn't steal data, I simply reclaimed what was rightfully mine. I spent the day packing my office, moving with the methodical precision of a coroner clearing a crime scene. I placed my industry awards, my framed photos of company picnics from a decade ago, and my chipped coffee mug into a cardboard box. But the most important item was my personal leather-bound notebook. This wasn't company property, it was my brain on paper. It contained the direct numbers of warehouse managers who would keep a dock open late for me if I asked nicely, the mechanics in rural Wyoming who would fix a transmission on a Sunday for cash, and the handwritten notes on every driver's family situation, allergies, and preferences. Tyler watched me from his glass office, looking smug, sipping an espresso. He believed that by digitizing the customer list and the route history, he had captured the essence of the business. He didn't understand that logistics is a relationship business, built on favors, trust, and memory. And he had just fired the only person who knew the people behind the data points. As I walked out, I stopped by the desk of Joe, a young dispatcher I had been mentoring for the past year. He looked terrified, staring at a screen full of flashing red alerts he didn't understand. "Who do I call if the server goes down, Martha?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I squeezed his shoulder, feeling a pang of guilt that I was leaving him behind. "You call Tyler," I said, loud enough for the room to hear. "He says the code has all the answers. Let the code fix it." I didn't even make it to my car before my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was David, the CEO of Blue Rock Transport, our fiercest and most respected competitor. In this industry, secrets travel faster than fiber optics, and the smell of blood in the water attracts sharks. "I heard you're a free agent," the text read. "Lunch? I'm buying. No agendas." We met at a diner halfway between the two headquarters, a place that smelled of grease and old coffee, the kind of place where real business deals are made. David didn't have a tablet or a flashy PowerPoint presentation. He had a firm handshake and a paper contract. "I have 50 new Volvos sitting in my yard," he said, cutting his steak with the precision of a surgeon. "And I have a dispatch team that needs a general. I don't want an app, Martha. I want someone who knows that snow chains don't install themselves and that a driver isn't a robot." The offer was generous: Vice President of Operations, full autonomy to run the department as I saw fit, and a salary that made Ironclad's customer experience monitor look like pocket change. I signed it before the check arrived. I wasn't just joining a competitor, I was joining the opposition army. And I was bringing my entire arsenal of experience with me. The chaos at Ironclad was slow at first, a creeping rot rather than a sudden explosion. In my first week at Blue Rock, while I was setting up my new office, a corner suite with a view of the actual truck yard, not just the city skyline, I kept an ear to the ground. The stories started trickling in from the truck stops and the online forums where drivers gathered to vent. Tyler's grid was optimizing routes based purely on math, ignoring the physical realities of the road. It was sending 53-foot trailers down historic residential streets in Pennsylvania because the GPS identified them as being 0.4 miles shorter than the highway route. It didn't know about the low-hanging oak trees, the tight turns that a sedan could barely navigate, or the local ordinances banning commercial traffic. Drivers were getting stuck, tearing down power lines, and getting slapped with massive municipal fines. It was scheduling pickups at warehouses during their lunch breaks, forcing drivers to sit idle for hours while their federally mandated driving clocks ticked away, burning fuel and patience in equal measure. The drivers were furious. They were calling dispatch and getting voicemail, or worse, getting Tyler, who would lecture them on adhering to the optimized path and refusing to listen to their on-the-ground reality. Morale didn't just drop. It evaporated, replaced by a simmering resentment that was dangerous in an industry where focus is everything. Then came the call that signaled the beginning of the end. It was Frank, the plant manager of the Detroit Auto Assembly, Ironclad's biggest and most critical client. He called my old desk, got the automated runaround, and then tracked me down at Blue Rock through sheer desperation and a few calls to mutual friends. "Martha," he yelled into the phone, the sound of a halted assembly line screeching in the background, a sound that costs automotive companies thousands of dollars a minute. "Where are my engine blocks? Your old system says they are in transit, but they should have been here 4 hours ago. I have workers standing around playing cards." I pulled up the weather radar on my new monitor, overlaying it with the route I knew the grid would have chosen. I saw exactly what had happened. "Frank," I said calmly, projecting the confidence he was desperate to hear. "I bet the grid routed them through the I-90 corridor to save fuel because it's flatter. But there's a 30-mile-per-hour headwind there today coming off the lake. A fully loaded truck can't make speed in that. It drags them down like an anchor." There was a silence on the line as the realization hit him. "They are going to shut down my line, Martha. That's $1 million an hour." He took a breath, his voice trembling. "Does Blue Rock have capacity? If I void the contract with Ironclad right now for non-performance, can you help me?" I smiled, looking at my new fleet board, where my drivers were positioned exactly where they needed to be. "I have 5 teams ready to roll, Frank. We can be there by morning. I'll send the contract over now." But the real disaster, the one that would make the Detroit incident look like a minor hiccup, was gathering over the Rocky Mountains. It was late November, and the meteorological models were screaming blizzard. At Blue Rock, I initiated Protocol Winter. I issued a fleet-wide order to reroute all westbound traffic south through Arizona. It was an expensive decision, extra fuel, extra miles, extra driver pay, but it guaranteed that the trucks would keep moving and the cargo would arrive intact. At Ironclad, however, Tyler was asleep at the wheel, mesmerized by his efficiency metrics. His algorithm looked at the forecast, saw that the Donner Pass was technically open at that exact moment, and calculated that the trucks could make it through before the snow accumulated. It didn't account for the fact that inexperienced drivers, the only ones left after the veterans started quitting in droves, would slow down to a crawl at the first sight of ice. It didn't understand the concept of tire chain laws or the sudden, blinding whiteouts that define mountain driving. He was sending 20 trucks loaded with perishable goods and time-sensitive electronics straight into the mouth of a historic storm. I watched the radar, seeing the purple bruise of the blizzard closing in on the pass. And I knew that by sunrise, Tyler's precious efficiency metrics would be buried under 10 feet of snow. The trap was set, not by me, but by his own arrogance, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The catastrophe did not announce itself with the cinematic flair of sirens or explosions, nor did it arrive with the frantic urgency of a screaming phone call. Instead, it manifested with the silent, creeping malice of a deep purple bruise spreading across the high-definition meteorological radar monitor mounted on the far wall of my darkened office at Blue Rock. It was late November, that treacherous and deceptive window of time when the Sierra Nevada mountains cease to be a scenic postcard backdrop for tourists and transform into a frozen, unforgiving graveyard for the unprepared. I sat alone in the room, illuminated only by the ghostly, pulsating glow of the weather models and the blinking cursor on my screen. Nursing a heavy ceramic mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching the barometric pressure readings drop with a speed that made my stomach turn. Outside my reinforced window, the wind was beginning to howl against the glass, a low, mournful sound that triggered an instinct honed over 2 decades of surviving winters in this industry. It was the sound of the atmosphere collapsing, the sound of the world taking a deep breath before a scream. I had already issued the executive command to the Blue Rock fleet 6 hours prior, a directive that was absolute and non-negotiable. Every single westbound truck under my command was to reroute 400 miles south through the scorched, flat, and boring highways of Arizona. It was an expensive detour, burning thousands of dollars in excess diesel fuel and delaying deliveries by 12 hours. But David, my new CEO, had signed off on it without a moment's hesitation because he understood the brutal mathematics of survival. A late load is a logistical headache, but a dead load is a tragedy that bankrupts souls. We were moving slower, yes, but we were alive. Across the city, in the climate-controlled, hermetically sealed glass tower of Ironclad Logistics, I knew exactly what was happening, even without seeing it with my own eyes, because I knew the fatal flaw in the machine I had left behind. Tyler's proprietary grid, the algorithm he worshipped as a digital messiah, was undoubtedly washing his war room in a reassuring, soft green light, blinding him to the reality of the horizon. The artificial intelligence was programmed to prioritize fuel efficiency, delivery speed, and profit margins above all else, pulling data from state highway department servers that were notoriously slow to update during rapidly evolving weather events. The algorithm saw a road status that read open in a database field, and because it lacked the capacity for fear or historical context, it calculated that a direct route over the Donner Pass was the mathematically optimal path. It did not understand that open in the High Sierras is a temporary and treacherous lie. It did not calculate the variable of mandatory chain laws, which require drivers to stop and spend grueling hours in the freezing mud, wrapping 80 pounds of steel chains around their tires, a process that destroys efficiency ratings and freezes fingers to the bone. It simply saw a line on a map and a 15% cost saving. Tyler was likely sitting in his ergonomic chair, smugly watching his trucks move toward the summit on his screen, unaware that he was marching his fleet into a trap that no code could escape, and that the silence from his drivers was not compliance, but isolation. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the sun had vanished behind the peaks, and the mountain pass descended into an abyssal darkness that felt heavy enough to crush bone. The first snowflakes began to fall, not drifting gently like a holiday greeting card, but driven horizontally by 60-mile-per-hour gusts, hitting windshields like frozen shrapnel and turning the asphalt into a sheet of invisible black ice. I monitored the emergency radio frequencies, a habit I had never been able to break listening, as the chatter shifted from casual boredom to tense, clipped sentences, and then to outright panic as veteran drivers from other carriers began screaming about whiteout conditions and jackknife trailers blocking the escape routes. And then, the silence of my office was shattered, not by a client, but by my personal cell phone vibrating violently against the mahogany desk. It was an unknown number, but the caller ID indicated a satellite connection, the kind of expensive link used only when cellular towers are buried or out of range. I answered it, pressing the phone tight to my ear, and heard a voice distorted by heavy static and the desperate, high-pitched whir of a cabin heater fighting a losing battle against the encroaching freeze. It was Miller, a 24-year-old rookie ironclad had hired to replace the veterans who had walked out. "Martha?" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror, barely audible over the wind screaming outside his thin metal door. "The other guys said you'd answer. We're stuck. We're all buried." I closed my eyes, fighting back a wave of nausea, visualizing the boy sitting in the dark thousands of feet up, watching his fuel gauge drop. "Where are you, Miller?" I asked, my voice dropping to a calm, commanding register, the voice of the mother he needed right now. "Donner Summit," he cried out, the words tearing out of his throat. The grid said we had a window. It said the storm was tracking north, but the wind hit us, and the truck in front jackknifed across all 3 lanes. "I can't move. I can't see the hood of my own truck." I tried calling dispatch, but it's just a recording telling me to hold for the next available agent. The app keeps saying, recalculating, over and over again. Of course it was. Tyler's system had no protocol for historic blizzard entrapment, so it was frantically trying to find a side road that was currently under 6 feet of snow. "How many?" I asked, grabbing a pen and scribbling furiously on my notepad. 12. Miller replied, his teeth chattering audibly over the satellite link. 12 trucks. We were running a convoy. We're running out of fuel to keep the heaters on, Martha. It's 5 degrees below zero. And the diesel is starting to gel. I sat there for a heartbeat, staring at the purple storm cell on my screen. I was no longer their boss. I had no legal authority, and interfering could get me sued for unauthorized corporate action. But I reached for my worn leather notebook, flipped to the tab labeled Emergency Contacts, and dialed Big Mike, a heavy-duty recovery specialist in Truckee. "Mike," I said when he answered, "I have 12 kids freezing to death on the summit. Ironclad isn't picking up. Go get them." Mike grunted. "The trucks are lost, Martha. I can't tow in this. The cables will snap." "Forget the trucks," I snapped, my voice cutting like a whip. "Leave the cargo. Leave the trailers. Just bring the drivers down. Put the bill on my personal credit card if you have to." Dawn broke over a scene of devastation that looked less like a highway and more like an archaeological dig site of modern commerce. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear, biting blue skies and 4 feet of fresh snow that sparkled with deceptive beauty. The news helicopters were the first to arrive, circling overhead like mechanical vultures, broadcasting the footage live to the breakfast tables of America. It was a visual indictment of incompetence so absolute it needed no commentary. 12 ironclad trucks, painted with the company's optimistic blue and silver logo, were scattered across the pass like discarded toys in a sandbox. They were buried in snowdrifts up to their windows, stark reminders of human hubris against nature. Some were jackknifed in awkward angles, their frames twisted. Others were abandoned with their doors hanging open where Mike's snowcats had rescued the shivering drivers hours earlier. The cargo inside those trailers, millions of dollars worth of high-end electronics, temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals that had shattered from the cold, and perishable food that was now solid blocks of ice, was a total write-off. I stood in the Blue Rock break room, watching the TV with David, my CEO. "He sent them straight into the whiteout," David whispered, shaking his head as the camera zoomed in on a frozen ironclad cab. "He debated with the weather, and he lost. He thought he could negotiate with gravity using a spreadsheet, and now the mountain has his fleet." The fallout was immediate, nuclear, and irreversible. Ironclad's digital switchboard melted down under the weight of furious calls from clients invoking breach of contract. The manufacturing plant in Detroit, the hospital networks waiting for medicine, the grocery chains waiting for produce, they didn't care about Tyler's optimization metrics or his explanations about statistical variances. They cared that their assembly lines were stopped and their shelves were empty. Tyler locked himself in his executive office, pulling the blinds, refusing to speak to the press or even his own staff. He was frantically trying to issue a statement blaming unforeseeable weather patterns and driver error, desperate to shift the narrative. But the industry knew better. Every logistics manager in North America knew that storm had been forecasted for days. The failure wasn't meteorological. It was managerial. It was a failure of character, a failure to understand that the map is not the territory. 3 days later, the real collapse arrived. It didn't come in the form of a lawsuit, but in the form of a procession. The drivers didn't go to Ironclad headquarters to resign. They came to the Blue Rock yard. I was standing on the loading dock, supervising the morning dispatch, when a line of cars pulled into our lot. It was a tired, angry army of men and women, still wearing their Ironclad uniforms, led by Jim, the veteran I had helped weeks ago at the border. They walked up to the dock, their boots heavy on the concrete, their faces grim. "We quit," Jim said simply, tossing his Ironclad security lanyard onto a crate. 40 of us. We walked out this morning. We left the keys on the security guard's desk because Tyler wouldn't come out of his office to face us. He sent an intern to collect the badges. Another driver, a woman named Sarah, spat on the ground, her eyes blazing with a mixture of exhaustion and rage. He told us we were just operators of his machine. He said the AI would replace us eventually anyway. Well, let his machine drive the damn trucks now. I looked at David, who was standing beside me. He nodded silently, a look of respect on his face. "Fill out the paperwork," I told them, my voice thick with emotion, fighting back tears. "You start Monday. And here, you are the captains, not the cargo. We don't drive into storms unless I say it's safe." The exodus of talent was the final nail in the coffin. Without drivers, Ironclad was nothing more than a real estate holding company with a parking lot full of depreciating assets and mounting debt. The lifeblood of the business had walked out the door and come to me. Contracts were canceled en masse. 6 weeks later, the notice of Chapter 7 liquidation was posted on the courthouse door. The bank was selling everything to recoup the debt immediately. David handed me the auction registration packet. "You should be the one to go," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It's only right. You built it. You should be the one to bury it." I walked into the auction house on a gray Tuesday morning. The room smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and desperate opportunism. Tyler was there, sitting in the back row with a bankruptcy lawyer. He looked shrunken, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, his tie undone, his hair unkempt. He looked like a man who had not slept since the first flake fell on the Donner Pass. When the auctioneers started the bidding on the fleet of 50 trucks, the same trucks that had been stuck in the storm, now recovered but damaged, I waited. I let the scavengers pick at the bones, driving the price up incrementally. And then I raised my paddle. "Blue Rock bids $2 million for the lot," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. It was an insulting price, pennies on the dollar, but I knew the maintenance records were incomplete and the engines likely needed rebuilding after the freeze. The room went silent. The bank's lawyer whispered to Tyler, who stared at the floor, refusing to look up. They had no choice. They needed the cash immediately to avoid federal penalties for unpaid wages. "Sold!" the auctioneer shouted, slamming his gavel down. I walked over to Tyler as the room cleared. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, filled with a confusion that was almost pitiable. "The data said it was open," he whispered, his voice cracking, still clinging to the only truth he knew, desperate to validate his failure. The variance was within acceptable limits. It shouldn't have snowed that hard. The probability was less than 5%. I looked down at him, feeling no anger, only a profound pity for a man who tried to quantify the messy, chaotic world and failed. "Tyler," I said softly, leaning in so only he could hear. "Data is just history. It tells you what happened yesterday. Experience tells you what's going to happen in 5 minutes. You can't code for instinct, and you certainly can't automate respect. You didn't lose because of the snow. You lost because you forgot that trucks are driven by people." I turned and walked out into the bright winter sunlight. In the parking lot, Jim was already scraping the ironclad decal off the door of his truck, peeling away the blue vinyl to reveal the white paint underneath, prepping it for the Blue Rock logo. He saw me and gave a thumbs up, his breath steaming in the cold air. I smiled, pulled my collar up against the chill, and walked back to my car. I had a new map to pin and a fleet to keep safe. The notebook in my pocket felt heavy, not with paper, but with the weight of promises kept. The algorithm had crashed, but the system, the human system, was running perfectly. Ironclad's collapse wasn't just a business failure. It was undeniable proof that while you can automate tasks, you cannot automate the human instinct that keeps the world moving. My silence in that conference room wasn't weakness. It was the strategic withdrawal of a safety net they didn't even know they had. Sometimes, the most powerful move isn't to fight for a seat at a table where you aren't respected, but to simply build your own table elsewhere. If you've ever had to quietly walk away to prove your true worth, know that you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs the courage to find their own path.